Hello friends, we are going to do the Poem in October, written by Dylan Thomas. Okay, let me tell you something about Dylan Thomas before we go on to the poem itself. Dylan Thomas was born in 1914 and he died when he was just 39 years old in 1953. Now his birthday is important to us. He was born on October 27th, 1914. And he wrote many birthday poems. So that is why I say that his birthday, it's good to remember his birthday. It is a kind of a tribute we pay to a man who was so obsessed with his own birthday. He was a Welsh poet. Now Welsh belonging to Wales. You know that the UK, the United Kingdom, it comprises of various countries, and that is why together they are called the United Kingdom. You have Great Britain, that is England, and then you have Wales, you have Ireland and Scotland, and then all the other hundreds of small islands scattered. So he was born in this place called Swansea in South Wales, and that is why he is known as a Welsh poet. Okay, W-E-L-S-H. And his father was a professor of English, and so this child, Dylan, the full name of Dylan Thomas is Dylan, D-Y-L-A-N, Marlais, M-A-R-L-A-I-S, and Thomas, Dylan Marlais Thomas. And since his father was a professor of English, the child was exposed to a lot of books and a lot of poetry reading right from the time he was little. And he developed a very deep interest in English literature and especially poetry. And he says that when somebody asked him about his poetry and why he was writing poetry, he said that he fell in love with words. And he says he used to love to listen to words. More than what the words said, he was more interested, he says, in the sound that the words conveyed. So it is this love for words that led him to become a writer. When he was 16 years old, he dropped out of school and then he took up the job as a reporter. You can imagine that his father would have been quite upset with this decision of his son, the great professor's son, dropping out of school. Must have been a terrible thing for the father. Anyway, Dylan, he dropped out and he joined as a reporter, and then later on, that too was not too late, somewhere when he was 18, 19, he decided that he wanted to become a full-time poet, and so that is what he did. And when he was 20 years old, he published his first book, a book of poems, and then that was titled 18 Poems. And later he married in 1837. He married a dancer who was named Caitlin McNamara, and he also took part in the Second World War as an anti-aircraft gunman, but then that was only for a short time because he was not healthy and so he couldn't continue his service. And in 1944, the couple, the family, they moved out of London. And they wandered around in many places. Now the poet Dylan Thomas, he was addicted to alcohol. Somewhere in his life he got into this habit of drinking, and it kind of totally took control of him, and so they always had financial troubles. Now his marriage, he did it against the wishes of his parents and her parents, and so they did not really get much support from anywhere. They were moving from place to place, but there were some well-wishers and admirers who were willing to help them, and finally they settled in a place called Larne. It's pronounced as Larne, but it is spelled L-A-U-G-H-A-R-N-E, Larne. It is a seaside town in Wales. And then he used to write most of his poetry from there, and he was a prolific writer. He wrote all kinds of poems, lyrics, odes, ballads, elegies, and then later on he even wrote short stories, and he has even left a novel, though he couldn't complete it. He has an incomplete novel, and then later he used to write scripts, and he has done scripts for some of them have become films, and he also did radio shows. He worked for the BBC. So he was a prolific writer who continued to write till the end. And the end, of course, was not very far, because I told you he died when he was just 39. And in 1950 he visited America. He received a very warm reception. And then he toured to many places in America, and he read his poetry. Many people flocked to listen to him reading his own poems. And of course, many of his poems in his own voice. It is available on the net, so you too can try listening. You can try listening to this particular poem itself, Poem in October, in the voice of Dylan Thomas himself. And so he went to America 4 times. Each time it was successful. His poetry reading sessions were immensely popular. He used to get into arguments with the people who came there, and it used to be boisterous. That is the word used, boisterous. And anyway, after all this rollicking and turbulent life, he died in New York in 1953, mainly due to his lifestyle. So that is the life of Dylan Thomas. Now, coming to his poetry, as I told you, he has tried writing almost everything, and he says that he used to read a lot, and from the time he was young, he also had this urge to write. And so he says that he used to imitate any form of poetry he would read. He would immediately imitate it. If he reads a sonnet, he would try writing something like a sonnet. If he reads an elegy, he would try writing an elegy. So he says, how else could I learn all these various forms? So I kept imitating, and I kept trying to write. So that is how he excelled or achieved mastery in poetry writing. And so his poetry was very different from the poetry of his contemporaries. Now, who were his contemporaries? T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, Auden. These were his contemporaries. And his poetry is different because he did not touch upon any social issues. While all these other people, Auden or Yeats or even Eliot, while all of them spoke about what was happening around them, they lamented about the war, they spoke about the selfishness of man and the kind of degradation that society was facing, all that they spoke about. But Dylan Thomas kept himself away from all these. His poems were intensely personal, highly sentimental. He was a romantic through and through. And so he was even called a neo-romanticist or a neo-romantic because he was very, very romantic. He preferred to indulge himself in sensuous kind of pleasures, even in his poetry. And he wrote about nature and the beauty of nature, exotic places, landscapes. And then he also wrote about, he was also, the themes in his poems, one is nature, and then God, religion. He was not exactly a religious person. He was a kind of an atheist, but then he did believe in some kind of a power. And so God, religion, death and decay. Death and decay is another recurring theme in his poems. He keeps telling us how right from the first day a person is born, he begins his journey towards death. So that idea of death and decay is often recurrent in his poems. And then love and sex, that is another thing he talks about in his poems. So in many ways he was different from his contemporaries. He was hailed as the poet of the sea and the woods, the countryside. And in his poetry, you can see there is a free and a very frequent mingling of the past and the present. There is a lot of pain in his poems. Maybe whatever he experienced, he wrote it. And so some of his poems are autobiographical because he writes about his own feelings. He writes about characters, real life characters who he had met in his life. So in many ways, his poetry is autobiographical in nature. And now coming to this particular Poem in October, Dylan Thomas has written 4 birthday poems. And I'll give you the names of all these 4. One The first one that he wrote is titled Especially When the October Wind. The second one was titled 24 Years. This one, Poem in October, is the third one. And the fourth one is Poem on his birthday. Okay, 4 birthday poems. And this one I think is the most popular, Poem in October. This poem was written in 1944 and it was published in 1946 in a collection which was titled Deaths and Entrances. Okay. Now, Poem in October has 7 stanzas. Each stanza has 10 lines and it doesn't follow a fixed rhyme scheme or a pattern. But then you can see that when you look at the poem, you just take the poem in your in a book or wherever on the screen and you look at it, you can see that every stanza looks like the other stanza. They are all similar in the length of their lines. The first 3 lines are long lines, and then the second 2 lines, I mean after the 3 lines, 4 and 5, they are very short lines. Then 6 and 7 are long lines. 8 and 9 are again very short lines, and 10 is one last long line. So in all the 10 stanzas, he has maintained the same length of lines, though he has not bothered much about rhyme. Now, so let's go to the poem. I'm not reading the whole poem as I usually do because it's long and it might take some time. So let's take them a little by little. So maybe I'll read the first 3 stanzas, first 3 or maybe 4. Okay, 4 stanzas. It was my 30th year to heaven. Woke to my hearing from harbour and neighbour wood, and the mussel pooled and the heron priested shore. The morning beckon with water praying, and call of seagull and rook, and the knock of sailing boats on the net-webbed wall. Myself to set foot that second in the still sleeping town and set forth. Stanza 2. My birthday began with the water birds and the birds of the winged trees flying my name above the farms and the white horses. And I rose in rainy autumn and walked abroad in a shower of all my days. High tide and the heron dived when I took the road over the border, and the gates of the town closed as the town awoke. A spring full of larks in a rolling cloud, and the roadside bushes brimming with whistling blackbirds, and the sun of October summery on the hill's shoulder. Here were fond climates and sweet singers suddenly come in the morning, where I wandered and listened to the rain ringing, wind blow cold in the wood far away under me. The pale rain over the dwindling harbour, and over the sea-wet church the size of a snail, with its horns through mist, and the castle, brown as owls. But all the gardens of spring and summer were blooming in the tall tales, beyond the border and under the lark-full cloud. There could I marvel my birthday away, but the weather turned around. Okay, so those are the first 4 stanzas. Now another thing which I should mention about Dylan Thomas's poetry is that it is often considered to be very abstruse or dense, difficult for the reader to understand. And some of the people who came after him, like Philip Larkin, for instance, Philip Larkin has expressed a great dislike for the poetry of Dylan Thomas because he felt it was too romantic and sometimes it was too dense. And there are, of course, a few, because he has written hundreds and hundreds of poems. There are a few of them, of course, which are simple enough so that we can understand. This too, fortunately, is one of them. But generally, when we talk of Dylan Thomas's poems, we should remember that they are a little difficult. Because that was, I guess, the trend. Because it was a time of modernist poets like Eliot and Auden, and this particular writer, that is Dylan Thomas, was very much influenced by Blake. He was a great admirer of William Blake's poetry, and he also liked Auden. And he was also very fond of the Bible, and you have in many of his poems and in his works, you have references to the Bible too. Okay, now let's come back once again to the poem. He tells us that this was his 30th year to heaven. And see, in this poem, you can see that he is telling us that he woke up on his 30th birthday and he started walking. And it seems to be happening in this place called Larne, okay, the place where he lived. But then, in reality, he was not there on his 30th birthday. He was somewhere else when he wrote this poem. But then, he situates the poem in this particular place, though he doesn't mention the name of the place. From the description we understand that he's talking about Larne, and so that is, when you look at it, that is the setting of the poem. Okay, so he tells us that it was my 30th year to heaven, the first line, 30th year to heaven. What does he mean by saying 30th year to heaven? That is because he has already completed 30 years. And so that means he is closer to heaven, because he believed that right from the time you are born, you embark on your journey towards death. So now he has already completed 30 years in his journey towards heaven. That is what he means by, it was my 30th year to heaven. Woke to my hearing from harbour and neighbourhood, mussel pool and the heron priesthood show, the morning beckon. So he says that I woke to some sounds. What are the sounds that he heard? They were the sounds from the harbour, sounds from the neighbouring wood, and the mussel pool and heron priesthood show, the beach. There was this mussel pooled. Mussel is a kind of a clam. It is, something with a shell that sticks onto the rocks on the seaside or in rivers. That is a mussel. Cockles and mussels. Okay, there is a song. There is a children's poem, a kid's poem, which talks about cockles and mussels. And mussel pooled. So he is talking about the little pools on the beach. In the rocks on the beach, you often find some pools where the sea water is kind of lodged. It is stagnant, and so in those pools there are a lot of mussels sticking there. And so that is why he says mussel pooled. And heron priesthood. What is a heron? Heron is a bird like a crane. You know what a crane is. It's a water bird. And often the herons, they stand on one leg as though they are immersed in some kind of a deep prayer. They look like priests who are praying. So that is why he says heron priesthood. Means on the beach there are many herons. He can see them standing like statues, very still. So he heard the noises, various kind of sounds, the usual sounds of the beach, the mussel pooled and the heron priesthood shore. The morning beckoned to him. To beckon is to call. So he felt that the morning, it was early morning and the rest of the town was still asleep, but he woke up. Something woke him up and he started hearing all these noises, and he felt that the morning was calling him with water praying. So again, you can hear, you can see that water or the sea, the waves, they are personified. What is personification, by the way? Giving human attributes to something inanimate. So here the water, the sound, the murmuring of the sea waves, he feels as if the sea is praying. It is chanting prayers maybe. So the water praying, and the call of seagull and rook. So he can also hear the sound of the seabirds, the seagulls, and the rook. Rook is the name of another bird. All these noises, these are the usual noises of the morning. And the knock of sailing boats on the net-webbed wall, myself to set foot that second in the still sleeping town and set forth. So another noise that he can perceive or distinguish as different from the noise of these birds and the waves is the sound of the sailboats. There are some boats that are tied to the shore because it is still night, and so the boats are tied there, and when the waves move, these boats go and knock towards the wall. net webbed wall. Maybe there are remnants of the fishing nets lying there on the wall. The walls are wet, and so he can hear this knock, knock, knock of the boats on the wall. And so, listening to all this, he got out of his house and he stepped into the sleeping town and he started walking forward. So that is stanza 1. Now in stanza 2, my birthday began with the water birds and the birds of the winged trees flying my name above the farms and the white horses. So he says, so my birthday, it's a nice way to begin your birthday, isn't it? To spend the early hours of the morning in communion with nature. That's the best way I think you can celebrate your birthday. And so he says, my birthday began with the water birds. So it began with all these cries of the water birds and birds of the winged trees. It means water birds and birds that were not water birds. The birds of the forest, maybe, of the woods, you remember he mentioned? Winged trees. Why does he say winged trees? Because the trees seem to be full of winged birds. So when these birds rise up from the tree, it looks as if the tree itself has wings. Winged trees. I think that can be considered as an example of a transferred epithet. I have mentioned it somewhere in one of my earlier videos about transferred epithet. A transferred epithet is when one quality which belongs to one a noun is transferred to something else. Here it is the birds that are winged, but he transfers it to the trees because birds keep rising and birds keep descending onto the trees, ascending and descending from the trees, and it looks as if the tree itself has got wings. So the birds of the winged trees flying my name. That's a beautiful expression, isn't it? So they are calling out, and he feels that they are calling out his name. But they are flying actually, in the flapping of their wings, in their chirping, in their cries. He can hear his name. And that is why he says, they are flying my name. It's a very novel expression. Above the farms and the white horses. So these birds are calling out his name and they are announcing his name all over the place, above the farms and the white horses. Now the white horses may be the horses in the farms, or maybe the white horses is also a reference to the white rimmed waves in the sea. And I rose in rainy autumn. So it is autumn because remember his birthday was in October. And this is a poem written on his birthday. So October is usually the season of autumn, just before winter sets in. And so it's a rainy day. And in those parts of the world, that is in England and all these places, in Wales and all, I guess they have generally a wet, a damp kind of a climate. And so, especially in autumn, and so it's a rainy day. And in spite of the rain, he gets up and walks out of his house, and he walks out of the town. So you can imagine, in your mind's eye, you can just see Dylan Thomas, because it's very easy to find pictures of the man, and so you can easily picture this man wearing a coat, maybe putting his hands into his pockets and just walking through this damp morning, listening to all kind of noises. So the poet he has set out walking from his house. It's a rainy autumn morning, and he says, and I walked abroad in a shower of all my days. So what can he mean by that? So one thing, I guess it is the shower. There's maybe a slight rain, a drizzle. But more than that, a shower of all my days, I feel, might be the memory of all the past years of his life. That particular day as he's walking, maybe they're all kind of drizzling down on him. So I guess that is what he means by saying, and walked abroad in a shower of all my days. In this line, high tide and the heron dived, Dylan Thomas has used a literary device called the zeugma, E-Z-E-U-G-M-A. Now a zeugma is when one word in a sentence, it applies for two other words. Like for example here, the single verb dived applies for both the nouns high tide and the heron. High tide dived, the heron dived. So what does he mean by high tide dived? Maybe the waves are rising and falling, so it is the fall. That is what he means, the high tide. And then the heron, and again of course you know about the flow and ebb of tides. So as he moved on, as the day began to dawn and as the sun began to rise, the tide slowly receded. And the heron is the bird that we spoke of earlier, the heron dived. So this is an example of zeugma. Like I'll give you another easier example. Like you say, I lost my purse and my confidence. So I lost my purse and my confidence. So the verb lost, it applies to both purse and confidence. So that is an example of a zeugma. So he walks and he says that he crossed the borders of the city and he went that side. And as he was moving out of the town, he saw that the town was slowly awakening because the day was progressing. So that is the second stanza. Now in stanza 3, a spring full of larks in a rolling cloud, and the roadside bushes brimming with whistling blackbirds, and the sun of October summery on the hill's shoulder. That's a long line. You cannot stop anyway because there is no pause at all. So he says there is so much of life all around him. And look at the way he talks about a group of larks. Lark, you know, is a bird, a songbird, and it is this lark about which Shelley has written To a Skylark. Okay, a spring full of larks. So I think what he means here is spring is the season of life. It is so full of energy. There are so many birds and everything is lively. So when he sees a big flock of birds, he is reminded of the liveliness of spring, and that is why he calls this flock of larks as a spring full of larks. And again, they're all springing around. That way also I think you can look at it, springing around, springing about. You know how a spring, it kind of keeps jumping up and down. So all these birds are kind of flying and flapping their wings, and they're so full of energy. A spring full of larks in a rolling cloud. So a cloud of larks just pass by, and the roadside bushes brimming with whistling blackbirds. And as he walks, there are plants on either side, and he can see that there is a lot of movement inside these bushes. And what causes these movements? It is these blackbirds. They are all busy. Early morning especially, the birds are very busy. They have woken up after a long night's sleep, and so they are busy looking for insects, maybe insects and worms in the plants. So there is so much of bustling activity. And the sun of October summery on the hill's shoulder. So this is October and this is autumn, yet in the morning he feels that the sunlight feels like summer. It gives him a summery feel. That is why he says the sun of October summery on the hill's shoulder. So he is slowly climbing, he is ascending a hill, and as he is climbing he can see sunlight falling on the hill. That's why he says the hill's shoulder. Again, the hill is personified and it's got a shoulder. So here it only means the side of the hill. He can see the yellow early morning sunlight falling on the hill. Altogether it's a very pleasant picture. Here were fond climates and sweet singers suddenly come in the morning, where I wandered and listened to the rain ringing, wind blow cold in the wood far away under me. So he has passed many woodlands. As he's climbing, there are forests, woodlands below, and he's climbing upwards. And he says, so as he moves forward, he says the climate is so fond. Fond here must mean pleasant climate. And sweet singers. Now who are the sweet singers? Of course it's the birds that he's referring to, and they all come in the morning, and he feels that they're all there that day especially to wish him a happy birthday. And he wandered and listened. He can listen to something else too other than the sound of the birds. And what is that? That is the sound of the wind blow cold. And what kind of a wind is this? A rain ringing wind. Means a damp wind, a wind which has squeezed some wetness or dampness from the rain. Maybe it is raining somewhere. Maybe there is this, it has rained before, a little moments ago, maybe there was rain. And so the wind is carrying with it the dampness of the rain. That is why he calls it the rain ringing wind, blow cold. So though there is the sun, it is not hot. Instead, he can feel the damp coldness of this wind. He can feel it, and he can also see the wind blowing in the wood far away under me. Now stanza 4. Pale rain over the dwindling harbour and over the sea-wet church. You can see that he uses a lot of expressions like this, isn't it? In the first stanza we saw this mussel-pooled, heron-priested shore, and then you had winged trees, and here you had this rain-ringing wind, and here you can see sea-wet church. Okay, so now he is, maybe as he is walking, he just stopped for a while and he looked back, he looked down, and far away, now the town and the church and the harbour and everything is far down, and looking from where he is standing, he can see it raining there. Pale rain over the dwindling harbour. Dwindling, something that is becoming smaller and smaller. And why is it a dwindling harbour? Because he is moving farther and farther away from it. And over the sea-wet church. How beautiful, sea-wet. Sea-wet, maybe the church is situated very close to the sea, and so maybe the high waves or the spray of the waves, they fall upon this church and they make it wet. That is why sea-wet. Or maybe it is the rain that has made it wet. So when he looks, he can see this dwindling harbour, and over the sea-wet church, the size of a snail, with its horns through mist. So he can see the church, and he can see a castle also. There is a castle, and you know that the color of a castle and maybe an ancient church, they are all brown in color, brown, greyish. And so looking from this distance, he feels that the church looks like a snail, a small snail which has got horns. If you have seen a snail, you can see that it has two horns. So these buildings with their towers, you know, the church also has a spire, so that is the horn he is talking about. And the castles, they too have horns or towers sticking up, and so they look like snails with horns through mist and the castle, and both of them are brown as owls. But all the gardens of spring and summer were blooming in the tall tales beyond the border and under the lark-full cloud. There I could marvel my birthday away, but the weather turned around. So he says that he could see, you can see in your mind, you can see the sea there. Though he doesn't mention about the color of the sea, you know that when it rains, the sea must look not blue, a kind of grey. And then you have this brown church. And then he says he can also see the gardens. But what gardens? Gardens of spring and summer, not the autumn gardens. In autumn, there would be very little flowers. You would see, of course, it would be colorful because all the trees would be yellow, and they would have yellow and brown and red, orange leaves. But the gardens are usually bare by the time the autumn advances, because it's all they're all getting ready for winter, and so all the plants kind of slowly start, shrinking into themselves. But he is talking about gardens of spring and summer were blooming in the tall tales beyond the border. So maybe these gardens are the gardens in the tales, or maybe in the stories, the bright colorful gardens that he has read in the tall tales. Tall tales are something that are not true, something that is imaginary. And so he talks about gardens which are blooming in his imagination, gardens that he remembers from his past, beyond the border. So here maybe the border can be the border between the real and the imaginary. So up to the brown as owls, the castle and the church brown as owls, it is real. But then beyond the border, the gardens which don't really exist there, but which exist in the tall tales. He might be speaking of imaginary gardens, and so he has crossed the border from the reality to an imaginary world. And under the luck-full cloud, there I could marvel my birthday. So he says now, and he was beginning to enjoy, marvel, he was beginning to wonder and enjoy his birthday. But suddenly he says, away, my birthday away, but the weather turned around. Suddenly there was a change in weather. So now a twist. Okay, a very pleasant picture, but suddenly something else has happened.